What's up everyone? In this video we're going to look at the Nikon D3 and I'll let you know why this camera is probably the cheapest pro full frame camera you can get and why you should consider one if you're looking for one of the most legendary professional Nikon full frame cameras. The Nikon D3 was released back in August of 2007. This makes it a 18-year-old camera in 2025. And back then when it was released, it was a $5,000 camera. Adjusted for inflation for 2025, that's about $7,700 in 2025 money. For reference, the Nikon D6 was $6,500 when it was brand new back in 2019. But don't let the age of this camera scare you. It's still an extremely capable camera. So let's just talk about the specs real quick. It has a 12 megapixel full frame sensor. It has 51 autofocus points. The ISO ranges from 200 to 6400 with a boost up to 25,600, which I think that's an amazing feature to have, especially back in 2007 when it was released. It can shoot up to 9 FPS. And if you're in crop mode, it'll shoot at 11 FPS. It has a 3-inch LCD screen. It has 2 memory card slots, both CF memory card slots. It has no video recording, it has no Bluetooth, and it has no Wi-Fi. Pros I like about this camera is actually the image quality. I think a lot of D3 users will really praise the Nikon D3 for the image quality. And another great thing I like about this camera too is the professional body and how it's built. I love holding this camera in my hands. It is a true tank. Another great thing I like about this camera too is the low light performance. It's actually not too bad, especially if you know what you're doing and what your settings are. And we'll get to this later in this video too. Another great thing about this camera is the very fast autofocus. Put a good lens on it and I believe the autofocus is just as good as today's modern cameras too. Another great thing about the D3 too is the live view. It's great for composing your shots, especially if you're in tight situations or tight spots, or if you're in a crowded situation. I usually just hold up above me and you can just compose that way. Or if you're in situations where you can't utilize your optical viewfinder, and we'll get back to this later in this video too. One of the things I don't like about the camera is when you're reviewing the image, you'll have to click on this button here and then you can zoom in with the dial. It's a camera made in 2007. I believe it was a predecessor, or its predecessors was the D2 and the D2Xs, and you had to press on the zoom button and then you can zoom with the dial like the D200s. Another bad thing about this camera, I don't think it's a bad thing, but it has no video recording. I know the D3S does video recording and the D3X does not do video recording. The only D3 camera series that does do video recording is only the Nikon D3S. The D3X does not do video recording and the D3 does not do video recording. Another thing about this camera too is that, as I said earlier, it does not have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, so you will have to transfer these photos onto your computer, then onto your phone. So you will not be able to transfer any photos from the camera to their phone unless you have a CF card that is Wi-Fi capable. I've seen that on Amazon, but if you've had experiences with that, let me know in the comments below. And then, you know, while it's a good thing to have, the live view is also a con too, because while it's good, it is not good for fast moving subjects. The autofocus is very slow, as you can see here. So it's not a con for me, but if you're a new photographer, the D3 is a very advanced camera. You need to understand Nikon's autofocus settings and what each button does to really understand how the Nikon D3 can help you get the photos you want. Personally, I like how the buttons are laid out, but if you're new to photography and you got the D3 or you're thinking about getting the D3, review the manual. I would highly suggest to review the manual and understand what each button does. And especially look at what mode helps you the most too, especially if you have a certain photography shooting style. And I know that D3 gets compared to the D700 a lot when the D3 pops up in photography situations or conversations. And between those two, it just really depends what you want to do. So just a little history between these two cameras, the D700 and the D3. A few months after the D3 was released, Nikon did release the D700. It was essentially a mini D3, but it wasn't as sporty as the D3. Looking at the specs here, they're essentially the same, but the D700 is smaller and lighter. We'll take a look at the release date. For example, the D3 was released in August of 2007. A few months later, in July of 2008, the D700 was released. Both have the 12.1 megapixel full frame sensor. Both of them have the 51 autofocus points. And I don't know if this really is a deal breaker or not for you, but the Nikon D700's viewfinder coverage is at 95% versus where the D3 is at 100%. For some, that might, you know, be a deal breaker, but for me, when I use the D700 and the D3, it's not, you could barely tell. For example, here This is how the viewfinder looks when you're looking through the D700, and here's how it looks like through the D3. If you can tell the difference, let me know, because for me personally, when I'm using both cameras, you can barely tell the difference. Both the D700 and D3 have the same ISO range from 200 to 6400 with a boost up to 25,600. The D700 does shoot at a lower FPS at 5 versus the Nikon D3's 9 FPS. And when you're in crop mode, you do have the option to shoot up to 11 FPS in crop mode with the D3. D700's shutter rating is rated at 150,000. The D3 is rated at 300,000. Right now I have a little over 160,000 shutters on my Nikon D3, and I believe my old Nikon D700, I had like 160,000, 170,000, and it was just perfectly fine. It was working the way it should. And my Nikon D3 is just still chugging along. It still feels like it's a brand new camera, performing the way it should. Both of them have a 3-inch LCD screen. The D700 has 1 memory card slot, whereas the D3 has 2 memory card slots. So as I said earlier, choosing between these two really depends on what you need and what you're photographing. If you need a faster camera, the D3 is the camera I would highly recommend you get. While the D700 is an amazing camera, the D3 does outperform the D700, especially if you're doing fast action photography. But you know, the D700 definitely still stands on its own too. And comparing the images between the two, if you're viewing them both on social media, it's near impossible to tell. And if you can tell which image was shot with the D700 and the D3, let me know. As you can see a few samples here and here. So if I had to choose between the two, it just depends what kind of photography I'm doing to decide which camera I would use. But I have brought my D700 with me on more trips, but I do rely on the Nikon D3 for events and weddings a lot more than my Nikon D700. I'm not saying the D700 is not a capable camera, but when you need a faster camera, the D3 is the one to have. So let's get into the Nikon D3's image quality. The D3's image quality is where I think this camera really shines. I think a lot of D3 users will really praise this camera for its image quality. And I'm not sure if it was unique to my experience, so I was using my Nikon D90 for a few weeks. And then when I switched over from the Nikon D90 to the D3, it just seemed like the D3's images were just a lot crispier. As for example, you can see here, these were shot with my Nikon D90. And then these were shot with the Nikon D3. The Nikon D3's color accuracy is also very accurate if you know what your settings are. So if you're looking for a camera that will give you good color accuracy without doing too many adjustments, the D3 is the one I would highly recommend. And talking about the Nikon D3's ISO performance, it's not bad at all. Especially with today's noise reduction tools and photo editing programs, it's pretty easy to get really clean images down. But I also think the high ISO from the D3 can give your images a very unique look too. And just to put it out there, the ISO performance really varies depending on what your settings are and how much light you're working with. There's a lot of great examples from D3 users that have shot in high ISOs between ISO 4000 and 6400. And from my experience, grain really does show up past ISO 4000. And I think any higher than that, I think it's going to be pretty difficult to recover your shadows or highlights with a noise reduction tool. Here's just a few high ISO image samples from the Nikon D3 right here. So let's talk about the sharpness from the D3. I think even with 12 megapixels, I think that's plenty enough to get sharp images. Throw a good lens on it and the D3 can give you very sharp images. One of my favorite lenses is actually the 60 2.8 macro lens, but I do love using the Sigma 35 1.4 Art and the Tamron 45 1.8. So overall, where does the D3 fit for you? If you're looking for a dependable second camera body, I would recommend the D3, especially if you have a set budget and especially if those other professional cameras are out of your range. I have seen the Nikon D3 on sale between $300 to $600, but of course that just really depends on the condition it's in. When you're comparing the D3, the D3S, and the D3X, it just really depends on the condition they're in. Which one would you choose if they're, you know, $500, same shutter count, both in good condition? Which one would you choose? The D3, D3S, or D3X? Let me know in the comments. I've been using mine for a little over 5 years now, and I have a little over 160,000 shutters on it. I bring it to automotive events, car shows, portraits, collaborations, basically everything where I would need the D3 to really help me get the photos I want. And every time I use it, I just love having it in my hands. I think you definitely need to feel one in your hands just to really, well, in my experience, I know like a lot of photographers don't like the bulky feel, but when you're at an event, like a wedding or a automotive event or something where you need a more serious camera, the D3 definitely gives you a boost of confidence. I think the D3 still holds up to being an excellent camera, and I do believe that it's one of the cheapest full frame professional cameras on the used market right now, especially if you can find one that's in good condition for under $400. So if you're interested in getting a Nikon D3 or one of the lenses I suggested, I do have links on where you can get them in the description below. I've also done portraits with the Nikon D3, and I'll leave that video link in the comments below if you'd like to watch that as well. I think many D3 owners will agree that it is an amazing camera to own and use, just because, you know, the image quality from it, the accurate colors, the autofocus, it's a really well built professional camera body. And if you have one, please share your experiences with it. And if you have any questions about it, leave a comment below and I'll try my best to help. And if you watched this entire video from the start to here, please comment that D3 is a tank. And I really hope this helps you use your D3 more, or if you are deciding on getting a Nikon D3. So if you like this video about the Nikon D3, please hit that like and subscribe button, as it really does help my channel grow. I really appreciate you watching, and if you have any questions, again, with the Nikon D3 or any of the lens I listed, please leave a comment and I'll try my best to help. Again, I just want to say thanks for watching, everyone. See ya. Now I'm going to move on to the 85.